The idea that people said that because the South seceded over slavery, that therefore everybody must have fought over slavery is preposterous. I think that the actual act of secession of South Carolina had everything to do with Abraham Lincoln's election. Real quick, hold on, I'm gonna switch hats for this. Get ready for people to get mad at me again. There are a multitude of reasons why somebody would want to believe there were Black Confederate soldiers fighting with the Confederacy alongside.
Hello and welcome to our first episode of a brand new show on the channel. This is History Undone, Myth-busting. I'm James Hanson. Every episode we will choose a moment from history and I'll sit down with one of our experts to talk through some of the most common things that people get wrong. And we'll cover a few things you might not know. Today, it's the American Civil War, and I'm delighted to welcome from the US, Garry Adelman, Chief Historian at the American Battlefield Trust and Vice President of the Center for Civil War Photography. Garry, welcome to History Undone Mythbusting.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
By the way, I should say, you have some amazing YouTube videos of your own. People can go and check them out. Great battlefield tours and many more besides. Where did your particular interest in the American Civil War begin?
Oh my God, I'm one of those people who it happened at one moment. I picked up a book in high school and it took Civil War photos and found the same spot now. Something people do a lot of now, but that was not a thing in the 80s until I picked up this book about the Battle of Antietam, and you could see exactly what happened where. And somehow I transformed from a D history student into a complete obsessive of American history.
And I mean, you've written over 30 books and articles on the Civil War. Why do you think the US Civil War in particular attracts so many myths?
I just, well, first of all, both of those, the winners and the losers are in our country. So that means that it's been a lot of history handed down over the years. There have been schools that have been teaching a lot of things over time. And plus, a human drama like that, with, at least for us, so much destruction and death, has to generate stories beyond what actually happened. I don't think you need the myths because you have so many true things going on, but it's just ripe for myth. And we love our heroes and we love to make those stories as easily digestible as possible. And I think that has something to do with it.
And we'll get into the 5 myths you've chosen for us in just a moment. But I mean, as a historian, does it annoy you when people come up to you and they say, oh, Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope, which we'll deal with in full in a moment. But when you hear some of these myths, does it irritate you?
Yes, I mean, as a battlefield guide, of course, any guide who says, or presenter who says this doesn't annoy them, would be lying. However, there are understandable myths. There are some things that are very complex and hard to unpack and hard to undo, and other myths are just because people are just being lazy and they want to believe something, and thus they do. So, I mean, some bother us more than others. But to me, I want to be clear about this. I'd rather have, if somebody makes a visit to a battlefield or reads a Civil War or history book because of a myth, and then they learn another myth in it, I think it's easier to undo the myth than it is to create that spark to pick up that book or to visit that historic site in the first place. So myths even serve a purpose to help educate, even if they're wrong.
Okay, let's get into your myths now. Myth number 1, it's a big one, the issue of why people fought in the Civil War, especially on the side of the Confederacy. And I think what's really interesting about what you've said previously on this, Garry, is you're keen to separate why the war started and why people were motivated to fight.
Yes, and this is one that I understand a little bit because it is complex. This isn't as easy as saying it's wrong and we know exactly why. We know a lot, but when it's conflated, and like you just said, man, taking why people fought from why the shooting started to why the South seceded from the other northern states, it gets complex. But if we could separate those, it's pretty easy. And not everybody likes the answer. People hold their myths to be dear. They may have learned about in school. They might have been handed down through family, or they might want to believe a certain thing. But it is simple. The South seceded because of slavery. They told us this. And I would challenge anybody watching who's already getting their hackles up, getting ready. Oh man, Gary's telling me something I don't want to know. I would challenge you to find not an internet meme, not something that's been doctored, but find an old newspaper or an old diary or a sermon, where people said that they were seceding for another primary reason. They said it was because of slavery and the preservation of slavery. Now, did they mention other things like states' rights? Sure. Those states' rights concerned slavery. And did they mention tariffs? Yeah, they concerned slavery. So you can cherry pick and find some reasons why it did. And let me just address one more thing, because somebody's bound to say, well, I've seen on the internet, or I've done my own research and I found X and Y. You know, I would say that the idea that it doesn't appear, especially in newspapers, diaries, sermons, the things that people used, and the secession documents themselves, that it was for these other reasons. I mean, imagine a scenario where today I'm writing in my diary or journal or newspaper, and I'm thinking, ooh, we might have a big war, and this might not go too well, and why we're fighting might fall out of favor, or why we're seceding. So I'm going to lie to myself in my own diary. It just doesn't work that way. So everybody back then said it was about slavery. Only after the war was over did people say it was about states' rights, it was about tariffs and everything like that. As to the idea of why the shooting started, I mean, this was about federal property. The South seceded, and Fort Sumter, where the fighting started truly, is in Charleston Harbor. The South felt, because they seceded, that this was their fort, and the shooting starts over that because the Union wouldn't leave. Now, the idea that people said that because the South seceded over slavery, that therefore everybody must have fought over slavery, is preposterous. Okay, people wrote in their diaries and they wrote in their newspapers why they were fighting, because they were drafted, because they believed in the Union, because they believed in the Confederacy, for slavery, against slavery. Any reason under the sun why people enlist, by the way, today. Yeah, for the same either sense of adventure for a job or because they were drafted. There are a multitude of reasons, and the idea of them lying about that in their diaries is also preposterous. So I would just say that this is the most complex one of all. I understand why it's so pervasive, but I would encourage anybody to go past the internet memes, go past the things that have been doctored that leave out a convenient word, and separate why people fought from why the South seceded. And I think it comes into clarity, and we don't have to argue about this so much anymore.
I mean, it's a really good point as to just the sense of adventure being a massive part of why people signed up to fight. You see this throughout history. You saw it in Britain in the First World War. People thinking it would be over by Christmas. It would be a bit of fun, go off, fight on the front line for a few months. Now, of course, we know the real history, and we knew that was a massive misunderstanding of what was about to unfold. But that is pretty common.
Yeah, and I would wager, I don't know this on the First World War, but in the Civil War, people's diaries changed and people's newspaper accounts changed and their letters
Yeah.
home changed as the war went on. Some people that were fighting to preserve the Union were then fighting to preserve slavery later. We get to see the change, and all of us evolve in this way. And I would suspect that in every war you start finding that. For any war that lasts more than a few months, you're going to find the motivations and the purpose and the interest, adventure, disgust is all going to evolve throughout the war. I mean, we want to make things simple, but people are not simple in what they believe. And just talk to your neighbor today, and you'll come to that conclusion as well.
We should address what is arguably the biggest myth of all, which is the myth of the lost cause. Briefly, Garry, what is that myth, and why is it a myth?
Good, yeah, and it's also tied in with this. So the lost cause basically speaks to, and it is a myth. We can track that. This thing was not written about during the Civil War or before the Civil War. And it basically says that the South only wanted to be left alone. They only wanted to secede from the Union. They were going to free their slaves anyway. And really, what we're trying to do is all look up to the model of Robert E. Lee as the perfect soldier, as the next George Washington. And, and you were trying to create this thing where slavery really didn't have anything to do with it anymore. And in fact, our cause was noble. Now, first of all, I don't blame anybody in any war when you lose, 260,000 lives on your side for no reason. And in fact, you come out much worse than had you just left it alone in the first place. I understand people trying to explain this. This is human nature. But the lost cause was a very deliberate effort by, a few chieftains, but thousands of people in writing and changing the narrative, and it worked. It worked for more than a century, really, where people really didn't question it. And I learned in college that from a PhD professor that Civil War wasn't about slavery; it was about states' rights. And of course, when you look into it, you see what those states' rights exactly are. So the myth of the lost cause is still being debunked. It is still evident on news stations to this day. You still see it all over the internet to this day. And what people say about it again, and it has a lot to do with this whole slavery thing again. And if you have to say the Civil War is about one thing, it's probably slavery. But people still say no. My grandfather didn't own slaves. Therefore, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, which is a crazy leap. That might be why he did not why he fought. But as far as why the South seceded is a little bit crazy. So this myth of the lost cause in the end is a construct to really, rebrand why the South fought, what they did, and a matter to explain why all this loss and destruction, why were we occupied by Northerners for so long after this, why did we destroy our economy, why were the slaves freed so abruptly. All of that can sort of be explained by moving the narrative over, to a discussion about our nobility and about our personal rights and how we are George Washington and Robert E. Lee.
And how much can you say that it was the election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 that really ensured the Civil War would happen? Without the election of Abraham Lincoln, does it still happen?
Man, that's a really insightful question. I appreciate that. They are directly connected. Now, was it going to come eventually? Maybe. Was it going to come once Lincoln was elected, or at least was the South going to secede once Lincoln was elected? Absolutely. They simply perceived him, and this is a war of perception in the end. And think about our leaders to this day in England, America, anywhere. Think about how we perceive them, and that may or may not be how they actually are. Lincoln was perceived as being hostile to slavery, despite that he said he wasn't, despite that he wasn't going to interfere with it where it already existed. But the South simply couldn't abide by it. And once the most, the states with the most to lose from losing their slaves, South Carolina, followed by a bunch of other ones, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, these deep South sort of states. Once they started going, they then sent commissioners to other states to sort of make the argument. And once the fighting started, then Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and others are going to secede as well. I think that the actual act of secession of South Carolina had everything to do with Abraham Lincoln's election. It doesn't mean there wasn't anything else, but the timing of it had to do with that.
Well, given we're talking about Abraham Lincoln, let's move on to your second myth, Garry, which is all around the Gettysburg Address. People say it was written on the back of an envelope. What is your response?
Yeah, this is one of those that you just, that I don't excuse people for. Maybe they were told it that, but anybody who sees a copy of the Gettysburg Address sees that it's on White House stationery or regular old paper. Okay, so right away you have that. Secondly, you then have, the idea that there are multiple other copies and there's never been one on the back of an envelope. Then we have people talking about when he wrote it, and to an extent, even Lincoln telling other people when he wrote it. He started writing it in Washington. That's why it's on Executive Mansion stationery. It wasn't called the White House yet. It was the Executive Mansion. And then we have good accounts of him finishing the writing in Gettysburg, not on the train. And this myth doesn't even get us anywhere other than to maybe call Lincoln more of a genius, because he could just jot down America's greatest speech on the back of an envelope on a bumpy train. But rather that he was walking around where he stayed and where his Secretary of State stayed next door, making improvements all the way up until, hours before the address was given. So we know this already, but if I may, this is just one of, if Gettysburg is the Kentucky Derby of American battles, sort of, or at least of Civil War battles or battlefields, because it's the first one preserved. It's the biggest. It's near population centers. It's got the Gettysburg Address. There's so many reasons why Gettysburg is sort of this, trifecta of battlefields. So it's going to have myths along with it. It wasn't fought over shoes. You didn't have, these idiot generals making stupid mistakes in the middle of it. The Confederates couldn't have walked down a hill called Culp's Hill, and you just got a lot of myths like this. And that goes on to the famous images of it. You take a picture and it must be this person, or if something happened, it must be this famous person from a movie or something like that. So we like our Gettysburg myths. They're pretty easy to undo. People don't cling to the Gettysburg Address one very carefully because nobody has a real stake in that one. It's a whole different ballgame. And in a way, I should like it more because it's so easily undone and people don't suggest I should be fired, like the last subject we discussed when I talk about it.
Yeah, but there is a debate, though, about exactly where in Gettysburg he gave the address.
Absolutely. So, the debate is not big. We know within feet where it was. We have photographic evidence of where the platform is. There have been some movements lately to shift that platform and to change the shape so that maybe he's a few, and I mean feet, different, and that might place part of that platform into the national cemetery as opposed to the local town cemetery. But this is a debate about almost nothing, because we basically know, where it was actually done. Now, as to why we don't have a better picture of him actually giving it, maybe because of the length, because it was only 2 minutes. Nobody expected it to be short except him, the people he showed it to, and the guy who invited him, David Wills, who asked him to deliver a few appropriate remarks. He was not the main speaker. So maybe the photographers didn't know that. And the multiple photographers, the 4 or 5 of them who were there, just weren't ready for that moment, and they also weren't close enough. I think they were set up pretty far away, so people like to argue about that too. Every guy with a top hat is suddenly Abraham Lincoln. Buy my photo, it's worth $1 million because it's got a top hat in it.
You mentioned, Gary, some of the other myths about Gettysburg and the Battle of Gettysburg. One of them you mentioned was about the shoe factory and this idea it was fought over shoes. Is
Yeah.
that definitely a myth? Because I was listening the other week to a very well-respected history podcast here in the UK, and they said, oh yeah, there's a big shoe factory in Gettysburg. Is that all wrong?
Man, so there's a guy in Britain I really respect and I love his stuff, and I hope he didn't say there was a shoe factory, because there is. Oh, look, I hadn't had my Civil War hat on yet. There, there is no shoe factory in Gettysburg. There are shoe stores, there are cobblers and everything like that, but there's no shoe factory. There's no mention of the battle being fought over shoes for about 14 or 16 years after the battle, when a Confederate, a guy named Heath, whose troops did, march to Gettysburg, sort of, to bring on the battle, said, as for the Battle of Gettysburg, that started about me going over a rumored supply of shoes. Now, there could be a rumored supply of shoes in a place without there being actual shoe factory, right? But the Confederates had just marched through there 5 days earlier. Jubal Early's troops marched through Gettysburg, ransomed the town. Surely they would have cleared out all those shoes anyway in the first place. And again, when something doesn't come up for 14 years in something that is the most written about Civil War event, in a war, by the way, in which there has been a book or booklet written every day about the Civil War since the Civil War, every day, and most of them aren't very good, by the way, but 14 years, nobody mentions this thing. Nobody in their official reports, nobody in town, anything like that. It's, history's not that tidy. It just doesn't work that way. So I can't give any credence to that. And by the way, everybody did write about why the battle fought, because the roads led the troops there, and it's tough to pass through that part of Pennsylvania without going through Gettysburg. It's really, they told us why. And then one guy mentioned it later, and it stuck. Okay. How quaint that these mighty armies would fight because of shoes. Now, footwear was a big deal. The Union Army was probably in as great need as the Confederate Army for that at the time. And both sides had been through the town before the battle started.
Well, let's come on to myth number 3. And look, I suppose you could say myths around shoes and the Gettysburg Address are relatively harmless, but your next one is a very pervasive and potentially very damaging one, and that is the myth of the Black Confederates. Just tell us about this myth, Gary.
Yeah, real quick. Hold on, I'm going to switch hats for this. Get ready for people to get mad at me again. This is not, unlike the Lost Cause, which you can trace back, a century plus. This myth really became much more pervasive in the 1980s and 1990s, sort of as interest in the Civil War kind of came about, and maybe in support of the Lost Cause. That and part of the Lost Cause was, the slaves were actually, they were kind of happy and they were better off, and they got dental care, and things were a lot worse for them afterward and things like that. So this myth sort of sprouted up that because we have anecdotal evidence, you go to a battlefield, you look at the official reports, and even in some of the original documents, they say we saw a black man wearing a Confederate uniform. And then you could look at photos, some of which are doctored, some of which are not, that seem to show, Black Confederates in uniform and everything like that. Now, so that's the myth. The myth is that there was not one, but there were hordes, sometimes as many as 70,000 Black Confederates fighting, either because they loved their circumstance or for the promise of freedom or something like that. What we have is a whole lot of good evidence of the Confederacy talking about this throughout the war. And until 1865, anybody who brought it up was sort of, rejected and ostracized. One of the most Confederate of all Confederates and one of their most capable commanders, Patrick Cleburne, raised this idea in the spring of 1864. And you would think he was, condemning God himself, for doing so. So until like late in the war, the Confederacy really never got interested in it. Once they realized it wasn't going their way, by 1865, they were, as an act of almost desperation, authorized the creation of Black Confederate units. So again, you've got these shreds of truth, right? But these were never formed many historians have challenged anybody to find a legitimate document showing an enlistment of a Confederate, show a Black Confederate being paid, being mustered into a unit, being issued weaponry. Now, did some fight along, their slaveholders? Sure. We have some of that, but the myth is about these organized hordes of Black Confederates tipping the scales in the balance or something like that. And people get real mad and worked up about this too, mostly, in the internet age where, you can take a picture of actual Black men in Union uniforms and put them next to a Confederate officer in a doctored picture, and suddenly people assume that these are Louisiana Confederates. They're Black Confederates. Oh my God. Instead, they are former slaves who were joining Union ranks and things like that. So every one of these major suggestions that people put out every year or two to prove the myth of the Black Confederates are always debunked. But this is one pervasive myth. We on the American Battlefield Trust at battlefields.org, we provide the primary sources for that and say where it was mentioned. Again, shreds of truth in almost every myth. There are Black people fighting on the side of the South at some point. Is this really going out to drag a body off a battlefield while you're holding a knife, or somebody who's actually caught in the crossfire, or someone actually with a firearm, doing it? But the myth is about the hordes. I'm talking about 1, 2, 11, 14 that might have been mentioned over the years as being there, but never mustered into the Confederate Army. This is a tough one because people get really worked up about this, and people hold their myths pretty dear.
Yeah, and I suppose it raises the question, why is the myth still so pervasive? Is it because for some people, they still struggle to come to terms with the role that slavery and race had in the Civil War?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. And not to mention, today's racial relations as well. I mean, if you look at from the 80s to now, there are a multitude of reasons why somebody would want to believe, that, there were Black Confederate soldiers fighting with the Confederacy alongside. Does that not paint the Confederates as a little bit, less wrong in what they were doing? Because if the slaves are on their side, well, my word, we have an army of the enslaved. We are outfitting them and giving them almost, sort of license to be part of the society in a different way. So, if true, I could see a bunch of benefits. And, and other people were simply innocently taught it. I've ran into a lot of Yankees, Northerners, shall I say, or, Northern minded people, who really still believe in this myth. It's come on pretty strong in recent decades, but people don't really talk about it more now. A guy named Kevin Levin wrote about the myth of the Black Confederates, and really, man, really shoots it down. And he's pretty active, and he gets some unkind email as well about this. It's a myth that probably shouldn't be there, but it still needs more tamping down because it simply isn't true, at least the way most people state it.
And am I right in saying, Gary, it's even made its way into classroom books?
Absolutely. So, in this country, at least, there's only a discrete number. They don't make textbooks for all 50 states, and yet all 50 states plus territories have their own standards. So they're able to form them. And sort of a lot of people in the North are using California's and New York's textbooks, and a lot of people in the South are using Florida and Texas's textbooks. And surely, if you go back to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and to this day, Southerners and Northerners look upon the same event differently. And both are probably cognizant of the narrative they are telling. It is where I work, our biggest goal is to tell the story down the middle without judgment. And I hope I haven't judged the people of the past too harshly. I judge people of the present a lot more than I do the people of the past. So absolutely, you can track these textbooks over the years. Maybe these myths are known and still inserted, or more likely not known and inserted into textbooks and taught in classrooms and things like this. One of the things that we do a lot is provide videos, for people to teach that history down the middle. Because, the idea of wishing the death of people who have been dead for 100 plus years and trying to fight that again isn't as productive as trying to understand the past and what we can learn from it, most importantly. So, it's out there. It's out there a lot, and this is what myths are, and I guess it keeps people like me in a job.
And what
Let
about
me
the
say,
issue of Black soldiers on the Union side? How many were there?
yeah. So if you count the sailors, because you've got 180,000 infantrymen, but then are foot soldiers, but you've also got another 30,000 sailors as well. So 210,000. You could call that about 10% of the ultimate Union fighting force. And in a Confederate army where you have 900,000, a million in the whole war, 200,000 more soldiers and sailors is a big difference. And Lincoln himself credited that. Of course, if the war wasn't about slavery early in the war, it certainly became about slavery after Lincoln's masterstroke of, keeping England and France and others out of the Civil War by proclaiming the emancipation of the slaves, which he didn't really even have power or control to do until they won military victories on battlefields in southern territories. So, it's this whole thing where the North sort of, the war wasn't about slavery or it was to preserve the Union. Lincoln kept saying it until that moment. And then everybody started to see that this war was every bit of territory the Northern gained or every bit of territory the Southerners lost resulted in the loss of, more Southern property, the enslaved people, or more liberation if you're a Northern army coming in. So it's really weird how we talked at the beginning of this about why the war started and why the South seceded. But by the middle of the war, people started to see that, like it or not, you're an army of liberation if you're in the North, and in the South, you're fighting in a way to preserve property and a lot of other things, among them the contraband of war, slavery. So it's endlessly interesting, fascinating stuff, and at the same time frustrating that we can't get on the same page.
And just to engage in a bit of alternative history, which is what we love doing here on this channel, Garry, were the Confederacy to have seriously considered black Southerners fighting on their behalf in exchange for freedom earlier in the war, would that have made any difference in the outcome?
It's hard to say. First of all, what I do like about alternative history is that, and we do this in sports. I mean, one of my friends just mentioned that he's all of a sudden an expert on kayaking because the Olympics are going on. So we all become experts, right? And the best point to be an expert is if something failed spectacularly, well then anything else seems better, and therefore you're a lot smarter because you know what happened and you propose something different. Now you have to look at a lot. So if we engage in this idea that the South uses their slaves right away and they're going to do it in exchange for the freedom, well, first of all, are all these black soldiers actually going to stay South, or are they going to find a Union army and move over to the other side where they feel they might be better treated? Secondly, the South would still have the same problem. Now, the South had 4 million slaves, some say more, but they never mustered, that many even white soldiers. So I don't think it's reasonable to say that you could even, let's say that they were able to get 500,000, slaves in uniform and trained and everything like that. They still would have been outnumbered, 1.5, 2 to 1. They still would have had, for every Southern factory worker, the North has a whole factory. They still would have faced a lot of disadvantages. Not, and maybe they'd have gotten England on their side or something like that if they're saying, well, we're going to free our slaves now, and they start winning. All countries like to be on the winning side, and, so it's really tough to say. In the end, I don't think it would have made a difference because I don't think it would have gone as well as the Union providing the blue suit, to these, former slaves. I can't see that, going as well for the South. Beauty of it is, though, I could say it this way and we'll never know. And you or somebody else could say it another and we'll still never know. Obviously, the South made a huge error in not trying to, in not foreseeing this. I don't know if they should have foreseen it, but in retrospect, they didn't use this resource they had except for labor and whatnot. And they ended up paying a huge price. Now, maybe they're going to control the narrative later, but the South was broke for a long time. Their country was destroyed. They lost everything they feared losing as a result of seceding and, firing the first shot at Fort Sumter. So almost anything seems better than that.
Let's come on to myth number 4. And often with history, some of the key figures can be mythologized. So let's look at the Civil War leaders, starting with poor old George B. McClellan. I mean, his legacy, Garry, as a bad general has never really left him, has it?
Yeah, I guess, and this, for anybody watching who thinks suddenly, I am from Illinois, I admit it, but that I'm somehow propping up the North. I'm just going where the records tell us and trying to treat people equally. But on the winning side, it's easy to find villains. But if you're on the losing side, you're going to prop people up and say, and make excuses as to why it didn't work out. But McClellan is a hard to like guy, to start with. This dude, we know he overestimated the enemy's strength. We know he was conniving and writing back home about President Lincoln, and he's just a really hard to like guy. Now the troops adored the guy. As a historian, he's hard to like. But the myth of McClellan is that A, what an idiot, anyone could have done better. B, that he always overestimated his troops, and if only he'd put more in, he would have achieved great victory. And then C, that he was too slow moving and things like that. Now, when you start looking at the records, McClellan makes a lot of mistakes, okay? But you also see the troops loved him. This dude was a master organizer. He was great as an inspirer. He was a clear communicator. And by the way, this is what you need to command 100,000 people, which I'm guessing that most of your listeners, most of the viewers here have not done before, including you and I, right? You need to be a whole lot of great things: strategist, tactician, communicator, horseman, and all these other things to do well. And it's no surprise that very few people rise to the top to actually do it well, in the end. So the myth here is broad brushing into somebody into that they have one quality. And I guess McClellan, slow, out of touch overestimator, and that we take that and apply it to everything else. Like, why would Lincoln consider somebody like that? Well, he did a whole lot of things well, and the Army might have actually gone with McClellan, like if Lincoln didn't use him for a while. So it's this unfair way that we want to reduce people to one quality, and which is so ridiculous today. It's one of the most dangerous things in America, I think, is that we do this to our neighbors and friends in this fraught political environment, is that we don't talk, because we just assume this person supports X or Y, and therefore we have nothing to say to each other. And we do this to our past figures, and we treat McClellan like he was a completely incompetent guy. I'm no McClellan fan. But the idea that if he'd have just attacked with a few more people at the Battle of Antietam, he would have won, when the reality on the ground was everywhere he attacked with a few more people, the Confederates mustered superior numbers and pushed him back with great loss. So, there are reasons why people did things. Some people had terrible qualities. But McClellan, I think, as much as I dislike him as a person from what I know about him, I think he gets the raw deal.
Let's talk about Thomas Jackson, or Stonewall Jackson as he's better known. And that really
Yeah.
is the key question. How did he get his name?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so the name sticks, and it is deserved because him and his troops are standing like a stone wall at the Battle of Bull Run, or the Battle of Manassas, as they would have called it, because other troops, are thought to be fleeing or whatnot, and there's Jackson's guys holding firm. Okay. Now. There's some myths even with the naming. The idea is that the Confederate Army's falling back and Jackson's standing like a stone wall. No, it's that Jackson's standing like a stone wall. He needs help. Let's go to his assistance. And people then take it and say, well, maybe they meant it as a dig, like, oh, there he's standing like a stone wall. He's not doing anything. There's no support for that at all. But Jackson's men were standing firm. Other Confederate troops realized that they could help to staunch, to hold the Confederate line. And these Alabama, Mississippi, and other troops ended up doing that. And within one day, he was known as Stonewall Jackson. It stuck like almost no other nickname of the Civil War. But of course, he'd be thought to be this great commander without fault to many, and that's just not the case.
Just going back to Gettysburg, we were discussing earlier. How often do people say to you, what if Stonewall was at Gettysburg?
Yeah, not often, because there have been an army of guides like me that have answered for decades now. Well, he would have smelled real bad because he was dead for 2 months already. I mean, that's really it. I mean, that's a pretty far what if. Okay, but the reason people ask that question is because they are imbued with the idea of. I think I put my hat on backward. They're imbued with the idea of his perfection. Okay, when in fact the real Jackson shows that he had a disastrous campaign in Western Virginia. He, really let Robert E. Lee down in what we call the 7 Days battles without much explanation. Sort of a great lieutenant and could operate independently and had some great moments. I mean, the dude barely held on at Second Manassas against Union General Pope, who was not well thought of, but he had some great moments, such as, at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and at, of course, the Battle of First Manassas or Bull Run. So he's got enough victories, and he's compelling enough, and he died mid-war, shot by his own troops. A great story that people have then, as part of the lost cause as well, propped him up as this great military leader. Man, you probably didn't want to be in this guy's command. You'd be absolutely exhausted. You would never be told the plan. You would probably be arrested. He was a very mercurial guy. You probably wouldn't want to be in his command, but he did deliver some victories, and I would say most namely in the Shenandoah Valley in 1862. So, when it comes to Gettysburg, would he have acted any better? The one thing I would say is that it would not have required Robert E. Lee to reorganize his entire army on the eve of the largest battle and the biggest defeat he would ever suffer. So if Jackson were still in command, Lee would have two wings of guys he trusted. Instead, Lee is going to have three commanders, two of which had never been at that level before. And I think that might be part of the idea of showing, could Stonewall Jackson have done all the things, the people say he wouldn't have stopped on July 1st. He would have seized the heights south of town. I just don't know everything that I know about the disposition of the Union troops. See, to do that what if stuff, what you do is you don't just say what you want to say. You examine the situation as close to the moment of departure, in this case of where Jackson would have attacked, as we know. And there were a lot of Union troops up there. There were a lot of reserve Union troops. Jackson's troops would have been exhausted from their victory if it even played out in that manner. So it's a non-issue. It's a fun one to talk about, but I would say that it's gone down because so many of us have denigrated the idea of people saying, "What if Jackson were there?"
You see, myth busting works.
Yes, yeah, in a way. Shaming does too.
Let's talk about, whilst we're talking about Civil War leaders, Ulysses S. Grant. Was he always drunk?
Yeah, so Grant, he's getting a good polish up in the recent decade, not the least of which is because of Ron Chernow's excellent biography of him, as well as the History Channel's mega documentary on him, which is one of the most popular shows of the last 20 years. So he's sort of getting polished up a little bit. But the myth goes that he is a drunken butcher that doesn't like Jewish people, that only won because of his superior numbers, and he was willing to waste his troops. Shreds of troops in every myth. The guy did drink. He did write some unkind things about Jews like me. He did you know uh, you know see an unheralded amount of loss under him, and he did understand the idea of using those numbers in order to win. But there's a lot more nuance to the guy. You actually fast forward to his funeral, where you had a Native American, an African American, a Jewish person, all as his pallbearers actually there. He became one of the most popular people in the entire world for not only preserving, helping to save the Union as much as anybody else, but for his world tour and everything like that. So, in a way, he's starting to reclaim some of his old fame. All of the things people say about him, drunken butcher, anti Semite, and otherwise, have those shreds of truth, but they are just broad brushed. Grant was nuanced. He was a great tactician and strategist. He didn't get it right all the time. You try fighting every day for 10 months against the Confederates' most tough opponent, Robert E. Lee, who I imagine we might talk about as well. And you see if you're going to lose a lot of soldiers to bring this thing to an end the way Lincoln actually wanted to. So I think he gets an unfair shake. We don't know him to be drinking in the Civil War at important times. We don't we do know he regretted one of his bloodiest charges, say at Cold Harbor. And I just think that there's a lot more nuance to it than people give him credit for. I think that he is a strategist and a tactician and knows when it's time to launch that costly frontal assault. But this is complex stuff. I mean, they're doing all this without cell phones or walkie-talkies or anything like that, and they're trying to feed and move these massive armies with just logistics that boggle anybody's mind.
You mentioned Robert E. Lee, Gary. What are the biggest myths about him?
Well, Robert E. Lee, and he's really, mixed up with the lost cause here, and that is, that he was the marble model, that he's the ultimate American, that he's the next George Washington, and that he never messed up. And therefore, to criticize Robert E. Lee, especially in his lifetime, was simply taboo. And to do it afterward meant you were a traitor or you were favoring the North. Ask James Longstreet, who said a few unkind things about Robert E. Lee and was basically ostracized in a lot of the South. And he also had connections to U.S. Grant. So Robert E. Lee, to be sure, and his arc is very interesting nowadays because, to be sure, he is the most important Confederate thing. I don't mean most important Confederate person. I mean of anything. More important than the Army, than the government, than Jeff Davis, than anything. I mean, he became the Confederacy by the end of it, and he is the commander you do not want to face. This is a wildly capable commander who made mistakes, who was fallible, who had no answer to what U.S. Grant did, although he held on for a while, but he knew he wouldn't be able to, even foresaw that. So Lee was not perfect. And, the idea people throw out a lot of, Lee freed his slaves and Grant didn't. And it's this idea of trying to make Lee this perfect Southern soldier. He's good enough. Without adding any myths to it, that he never lost battles, that he was this perfect guy that, that reluctantly accepted command for the South, which is true. Or at least he was tortured over the idea. So I just want to place Lee into a realistic light. I've been doing this for 30 plus years, but nowadays, all of a sudden, because Robert E. Lee has fallen out of favor in a lot of American society, now I have to convince people that Robert E. Lee is a very capable commander that you don't want to go up against. He's the one guy you don't want to fight. So now, because people broad brush and mythologize people, now the myth about Robert E. Lee in some circles, especially in certain northern circles and whatnot, is that, Lee, slaveholder, lost the war. He wasn't too good to start with. And that is just not true. I'll fight against any myth as they, emerge. And I go on, I give a lot of Gettysburg tours, and I have to sometimes convince people that Robert E. Lee is this great military commander. Perfect? No, far from it. The best the South had, Army commander? Oh yeah. So
Yeah.
it's very interesting,
That is
watching the
fascinating
curve.
how myths can swing from one extreme to another. I did want to ask you, Gary, you mentioned Jefferson Davis there. Is it true he was captured in women's clothing?
No, massive myth again. The Museum of the Confederacy, now known, sorry, as the American Civil War Museum, has the coat he was captured in. Okay, and I don't know if you guys illustrate these interviews afterward, but I mean, you could go after the war, and you could see, or I'm sorry, after he was captured, some of the news thing is of him sort of fleeing in like a shawl because it was cold out. I mean, he's in Georgia. This is May 10th, 1865, and before long, those same cartoons change to where he has a little dagger. Then he has like a woman's sort of shawl on. And then all of a sudden he's wearing a bonnet. And then he's wearing a full on ball gown and a dress. And the dress gets caught on the fence and he rips. I mean, he's this, Confederate leader who's then imprisoned and there's nothing he can do about it. And they just destroyed him. I mean, anybody thinks the news in either of our countries, man, are rough today. I mean, this is not new. They just destroyed Jefferson Davis, for what he was wearing, and it's all a myth. We know what he was wearing, and it wasn't out a ball gown. It certainly wasn't Scarlett O'Hara's red dress, and he didn't have a little dagger that he's fighting against. And it's just, it's amusing and sad to look at the same time. By the way, they did the same thing to Lincoln, even in the North. They had him because he sort of came into Washington because of the danger late at night. First, they had him like, in sort of like bedclothes, and then he's in slippers, and then he's wearing like a nightcap, and then he looks like a skeleton trying to sneak into town. So people were rough on their political leaders back then too.
Let's come on to your fifth and final myth, and this is the myth of amputations. Approximately
Oh yeah.
60,000 amputations were performed during the course of the US Civil War. 3/4 of all surgeries were amputations. Why were there so many, first of all, Gary?
So first of all, I'm glad you asked it that way because this was a war. This was a time where if I went back in my little time machine, sort of, and said, "Whoa, whoa, wash that saw," and they'd say, "Why?" And I would say, "Like, oh, I'm glad you asked, because there's these little tiny things, and they live on you, and some of the tiny things are good, and some of the tiny things are bad. And if the bad ones get in the wrong place, bad stuff's going to happen." Now, they weren't idiots. They understood cleanliness. They understood putting the latrine downstream from the drinking water source. But this idea of dealing with internal injuries and the truth of understanding infection, if you couldn't see and smell it, it was going to be harder to diagnose, at the time. So amputation was a way to take a wound of the extremities and turn it into a wound they could treat. Okay, they couldn't treat, musculature and fragmented bone and everything the way that we can today. So what they would do is, and this is going to be part of the myth, is that they would cut it in such a way to ensure preservation of life. And if you lost a finger or a toe, you had a 95% chance of accepting or of surviving that amputation. Elbow or a knee, 60% chance or 40% chance, depending. Thigh, like if you're way up on the upper thigh or hip, 10% chance of surviving. Okay. But what they're going to do is carefully, first of all, use some sort of anesthetic, usually ether. Also, morphine was available at the time, strong stuff, right? And we estimate that 90% plus, maybe 95% were done with some sort of a painkiller. Okay. And then they're going to first cut away the skin, leaving a flap that they can later tie off, carefully cut away the muscle, and then in just a couple of strokes saw through the bones. Okay. Which is a lot different from Gone with the Wind and Dances with Wolves and Glory, where people are screaming through their amputations, maybe biting down on a piece of wood or something like that. It is simply not true, at least in I would say 18 or 19 out of 20 cases. Okay. And even if they did, they weren't sawing through flesh. Okay. They'd have already cut that stuff apart and tried to make the sawing as quickly as possible. The National Museum of Civil War Medicine does a good job trying to bust this myth as much as possible. And I applaud that effort. It's actually great, if I may keep going, because not only did the Civil War result in the preservation of life through medical advances in amputation, but also this idea of the worldwide use of triage and trauma, of deciding who can be saved, who can't, separating people into various wounds, getting them a certain amount of care as quickly as possible, figuring out what's supposed to be in an ambulance and who does what and where it's supposed to go and how that communication works, was all laid out on a 4-page piece of paper after the Battle of Antietam. And both sides used it, and then the world started using it, and then America stopped using it, and then we got it back from other countries, and we use it today. And many of the people in the world, at least in my opinion, for anybody watching from other countries, typical American claiming, that the modern 911 or emergency system was all made up because of an American war. I believe that. It's the first time that, to my knowledge, that these things were actually written down about which surgeons were going to do which surgeries and why. It's a fascinating myth to be busted, this thing about sawing through amputations, and then the medical advances made as a result of this terrible conflict.
Yeah, you do still hear it quite a lot about this myth of drunken, incompetent doctors performing amputations without anaesthetic being used. Do you think it comes down to Hollywood and literature kind of, I don't know whether glamorizing is the word, but hyping up the extent of the
Yeah.
grimness on the battlefield?
Well, hospitals were terrible places, so I could also see soldiers writing down what they did. I'm thinking of the Battle of Gettysburg, a guy who went to see a hospital, it was his first one, and a soldier like who needed help because they're just laying out there, like in Gone with the Wind, they're just laying out there in the open, maybe with some straw or something like that, just laying out there. And a guy jumped up and tried to say something to him, and through the hole in his chest, hot blood or warm blood spurted out onto this soldier, and he never forgot it. So these soldiers wrote about the terror of the hospitals, and I don't think it's that much of a leap when you have hospitals and a pile of arms and legs outside of a window or outside of a tent or in a wagon or in a wheelbarrow, to leap from that to how they were cut off in this terrible situation. I would not expect Hollywood then or now, or writers then or now, to necessarily make that leap to understand the totality of everything, every scene that they write about or shoot. And it's simply a dramatic thing to do. I mean, Gloria is the best Civil War movie, in my opinion, ever made, and yet they've still got this myth right in there. And show me a perfect Civil War movie or perfect war movie of any sort. Although 1917, man, I love that because I don't know enough about that conflict to hate any parts of it.
I mean, it's a brilliant movie. It's a brilliant movie. Garry, you have comprehensively busted 5 enormous myths about the US Civil War. Before we end, every episode we ask our guests to bring with them one fact most people won't know. Brilliantly, you've actually brought 2 for us.
Yes.
We'll start with your first. It's well known the North was stronger financially and industrially, but how much stronger?
Now, I sort of mentioned this already, and let me just say that I regret the other 90 myths that we don't have time to bring up. So I already
Maybe another
teased
time
this.
we'll get you back and we'll do some more.
Yeah, and that is, the North. This thing you hear is not myth. That the North was sort of more industrial and the South was more agricultural than the North. I mean, this is as real as it gets. The South never had enough ships. They never had enough cannon. Their ammunition didn't explode as well. Their ammunition didn't fit the various, firearms as well. And for every Southern factory worker, the North had an entire factory. I just imagine fighting against something like that. If that factory has 40 people or 300 people, I mean, just imagine how outgunned literally you are and how better prepared the North is going to be to do that. So I love that. Did I bring up I brought up both of these facts already, but hit me with the other one.
The other one, and you have talked about the books about the Civil War, there are so many, but why are a lot of them not that good?
Yeah, well, I mean, for the same reason as the Hollywood. So we do have about 59,000 or so days since the Civil War and about 60,000 books and booklets. I mean, a lot of people write about a subject they're simply not qualified to write about. They got the idea, I want to write a Civil War book, not unlike somebody, I'm going to release an album. I would say most of the music ever released probably isn't as good as the Grammy Award winning stuff, right? So I would suggest that it's a lack of understanding, a lack of research, and laziness. These myths make it into books for a reason, and it's because people are using other people's stuff and not doing it for themselves. And they're simply believing their friend or their family or their teacher. And I'm sorry, like, I loved my teachers. I have great respect for everything I learned as a younger person, but we come to realize that our parents weren't perfect. And that's the case for our grandparents and our teachers and everything like that. And by the way, because there are 60,000 Civil War books, it means there are a couple of thousand that are excellent. And, there's still one coming out every day on average. I mean, and a lot of these are great books. I can't keep up with them. not remotely. I've got 150 on my list, and I got one shelf of about 40 of them back there I still need to read. So there's a lot of great stuff out there, and even whether you're reading historical fiction or straight up nonfiction, I encourage it. It's such a great way to paint the past with a better and more detailed brush, and maybe that'll make you go to that battlefield or visit that historic site, and better yet, tell other people about how cool it is, so that we all get into history a little bit more.
Garry, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back, though, very soon on History Undone, myth busting, to bust some more historical myths. And if there's anything you want to see us deconstruct for you, let us know in the comments. Remember to like this video and subscribe to History Undone with James Hanson. Goodbye.
Thank you.